Right, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has faced a wave of resignations overnight, with more than 50 of his MPs voting in favour of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. 10 of his frontbenchers have quit, including Jess Phillips, Afzal and Yasmin Qureshi. It was a tough night, wasn't it?
It was indeed a tough night for the Tories as well, in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling that government's Rwanda policy is illegal. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak held a press conference where he vowed to introduce new laws to ensure migrant deportation flights take off next spring. Well, we're joined again in the studio by chief political commentator at TalkTV, Peter Cardwell, and live from Kent is Tory councillor and former Home Office Special Advisor Claire Pearsall. Good morning, both.
Morning.
Claire, do you think that Starmer has completely lost control of his party?
I don't think he's lost control of his party. What this was is an effort of discipline from the Labour leader. He is looking at how he deals with his troops at the moment, and he put down a very strong message. It was a 3-line whip for members to obey the party line. And he gave them what the results would be should they wish to disabuse themselves of that. So he is looking like he is keeping to his word. He has told people that they would lose the whip, they would have to resign, and that's what he's done. He's trying to instill discipline over a very, very contentious issue. So I think that we will see probably further resignations coming through. People are voting with their conscience, as they have the right to do. But the resulting thing is that Keir Starmer now has spaces on his front bench, which are going to be quite hard to fill, considering the characters that have now just left.
Pete, I read something as I was driving in this morning that the 50 that disagreed would be, and there is this in every political party, in the Tory party, prime examples. This would be the 50 that probably don't agree with him, were more Corbynistas to affect people who would put their consciences. Yeah, no, see, jumped in there. Sorry. Like Jess Phillips, whose conscience told her to make that decision, having spoken to her constituents, and respect her for making that decision. I'm just stuck. Does this show him to be statesman-like? Does it show us that he has what it takes to make difficult decisions? Or does it highlight, and before we get on to the Tories, we're just talking about this, an impossible position?
It is an impossible position for Keir Starmer. It's something that he really feels very deeply. It is a matter of principle for him, and he's been accused of not having principles. He's been accused of blowing like the wind and basically saying what will get him elected. But this is something that really goes deep within the Labour Party. There are a lot of people, I'm not saying all Muslims necessarily want a ceasefire, but certainly there are heavily Muslim constituencies, including Jess Phillips' constituency, where she and others have been put under a lot of pressure to vote in a certain way. This is splitting the Labour Party. It's always been an issue which has been very fractious for the Labour Party, and Keir Starmer has had the biggest crisis of his leadership and the biggest rebellion. The question is what he does now, whether there are further sanctions for those people, or whether perhaps in his next reshuffle, there may well be one before the next election, although there's just been one recently, is whether he punishes those people or whether they perhaps come back into his shadow ministerial team. It'll be very interesting to see how this goes. There's a lot of bad blood in this. There's a lot of fractious and very deeply held opinions, but at the same time, it'll be interesting to see what goes forward, because they're united basically on the domestic front. They're very clear. They're 19 points ahead on the polls. They want to be the next government, but clearly on this issue of foreign policy, which is not going to go away, probably.
No.
I hope it does, but I don't think it's going to before the next election. So it's going to be something that's going to continue to divide the Labour Party.
It's obviously an issue of foreign policy, but even if it came about, nothing would really be taken seriously by Benjamin Netanyahu.
I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu is sitting in Jerusalem thinking, oh, Yasmin Qureshi's resigned, well, I'm going to have a ceasefire now. That's not how it works. But at the same time, this is a very, very important issue for people to express an opinion on. So many people want to know what their MP thinks and what our leaders think on this issue. So even though it doesn't have necessarily any effect...
It's about principle more than effect,
I think so, yes. And also standing up for constituents and reflecting constituents' wishes is a very tough thing. But that's the job of an MP.
Claire, can I bring you back in? This came to me, and things do, it's my age. The Labour Party, when Tony Blair gathered them together and won that resounding victory in whenever it was, 97, the Labour Party now looks back on Tony Blair as some sort of, I don't know, they don't look at him too favourably. What he did was he modernised the Labour Party, and you convinced that very red wall vote, actually, that got Johnson in, that he was serious financially and fiscally and militarily and all those sorts of things. You look at Starmer now, and that's his challenge, isn't it? His challenge is, can I get into number 10 by keeping all these different factions happy? He's not Blair. Do you think he's got what it takes? Do you think yesterday showed us that actually, yeah, he has got a bit of principle?
It's a start. Yeah. It's very, very difficult when you're looking at somebody like Tony Blair, who came in and not only appealed to those red wall seats, but also to the traditional Tory blue wall seats. Everybody saw him as a man with a plan. He was different. He was occupying a centrist ground. He had policies ready to go. He looked and sounded exciting. Starmer doesn't have that. He hasn't got that kind of personality. He also doesn't have the policies behind him. So this is a tiny, tiny moment for the Labour Party. Is it going to turn the tide and people think this is a government in waiting? I don't think it is. But it's the first time, I think, that we've seen a little bit of backbone from Sir Keir Starmer when dealing with his party. They've always been all over the place. And as Peter has just said, this issue isn't going to go away. It is an issue that runs deep within the Labour Party and has always divided them. So I think it's a start. I think it's a move in that direction. Whether it is enough to convince people they're the next government, well, we're a long way out for any election for that to be seen.
Peter, all morning we've been asking our viewers and listeners to get in touch. We asked, in the face of frontbench resignations, should Starmer change his stance on a Gaza ceasefire? Carl says no, he needs to stand firm. Mark says no, he should say what he thinks and not lie to us to curry favour with the British people, then change his mind if he gets elected. Now, on that point, do you suspect that he will stand firm on this, regardless of what happens in Gaza, no matter how many more images the British public see, no matter how many constituents across the country turn against him and really increase those calls for a ceasefire? Can you ever see him changing his mind?
Not at this point. I mean, it's interesting in terms of the fact that he is saying that he wants long humanitarian pauses. He does want people to get out of Gaza. He wants there to be a humanitarian approach to this. He wants to get food, water, aid in there. So it's not essentially saying Israel is 100% right at all times and, you know, it should continue to bombard Gaza. It is a slightly softer approach, but certainly when it comes to a ceasefire, I don't see him moving in that direction.
Is there any policy yet on taking people in from Gaza in terms of refugees, evacuees?
We're not there yet.
Okay.
Certainly, and also Egypt, for example, doesn't want to take in Gazan refugees at the moment. They've taken a few, but that's very interesting actually when it comes into the Rwanda policy as well, because Egypt is another country that the UK is thinking of having as a third country for Rwanda.
Can I go back to actually the really salient point that Nick made, and I think it's all about. I think Starmer's in a difficult position. You alluded to this an hour ago because of the anti-Semitism bias that was, associated with Labour when Corbyn was there. I think he's terrified on that front. But listen to this from Kevin. This is the first time, in my opinion, he's shown any backbone without changing it to the opposite 5 minutes later. So for every frontbencher that says, I've spoken to my constituents, what's more important to him? Because he can replace 10 frontbenchers. Is it the Kevins who's... I don't know where Kevin lives, but I imagine he's probably a floating voter. He might be red wall, I don't know. That's the gamble, isn't it, for Starmer? That's what he's got to try and prove to the British people.
Well, it is a gamble, Jeremy, but also he's also 19 points ahead.
Yeah.
So even if he took a 5-point hit on this, for
he's
example,
still all right.
it's not all about electoral maths, but I mean, it is. Politics is about winning elections.
Yeah.
So this is a point where he can afford to take a little bit of a hit if there are people who want to be annoyed with this and perhaps not vote Labour. But also it's a question for a lot of those people, where else do they go necessarily? There are some other parties, of course, but really the Labour core vote are probably not going to go too far. So there is an electoral calculation in this, there's a political calculation in this, but actually, even as someone who's been quite critical of Keir Starmer being a flip-flopper, I think, not just because of the anti-Semitism row within the Labour Party previously, but I think Starmer actually does believe this. I think this is something that's quite close to him in terms of his family background. His wife is Jewish. I'm not saying that that is necessarily the only reason that he thinks this, but there are definite influences there.
OK.
Claire, just to bring you back in, talking about Rishi Sunak now pledging to introduce emergency legislation to push ahead with his Rwanda plan. Do you think he just finds it really difficult to say that he's failed and he should probably give up?
It feels very, very much like that. The press conference yesterday afternoon was almost as if it was a toddler saying, well, hang on a minute. No, I'm not wrong. Here is what my plan is. It's very difficult to unpack this. The emergency legislation, okay, it's still going to get through the House of Commons. There are so many moving parts in this. For a treaty to be ratified, it needs to be ratified by both houses of Parliament. It has to get through the Commons, it then has to go to the Lords, and then it still has to go back to the courts. So none of this is quick. This dream of sending planes off by the spring, I think, is for the birds. It isn't going to go through. The Lords are going to look at this and say, well, hang on a minute, the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom has said that there are problems with the country that you're looking to send people to. They are not going to turn around and say, oh, well, it's okay because Rishi Sunak has designated this as a safe country. They are going to want to look at the detail and the evidence behind it, as they should. The courts are also going to want to see what evidence the government has that they're deeming this a safe country. So it feels a little bit like he doesn't want to admit Suella Braverman may or may not have been right. He hasn't got another plan, so he's pushing ahead with this. And you can see the uproar that it's causing from both parts of the Conservative Party. There are those out there saying we should just ignore international law, and there are those people who are saying this isn't going to work. What else have you got, Prime Minister? So it feels very much like this is going to be a monumental waste of time and money for the Prime Minister, but he has got nowhere else to go.
Claire, I couldn't agree with you more. Pete, if I can bring you back in, I think Claire sums it up perfectly.
She does.
No man's land. He had to rebut, did he not, what Suella Braverman said? He had no plan B. He promised me this and then he let us down, which made him scuttle out of Downing Street and say, I'm having a news conference, I'm going to sort it out. You can then say that's just electioneering, because if you sat down in a room with Rishi Sunak, could he justify or explain to you that this can actually work? And all of the time, and I said it an hour ago and I'm going to say it again, 170,000 people are in this country having whatever from this country, not knowing whether they can stay here or not because our processing system is rubbish. Why would, second time I've asked you this morning, our Prime Minister or our politicians not have the gumption to stand in front of the British people and go, do you know what? This is a mess and there are things that we've suggested that can't work and I might only be here for 12 months, but the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the Home Office up and running in a way where we can process this 170,000 people. I don't get it, Pete.
I think this is what a lot of people want to happen, and Rishi Sunak is sort of hamstrung in all of this. He has to keep continuing with this, as Claire says, but also by the time anything and any real progress is made, there'll be emergency legislation, it'll go through quickly. Maybe those flights will take off in the spring. I'm pretty sceptical about that. But even if they do, Keir Starmer is saying he is going to scrap this policy. And as the polls consistently show for over a year now, the Conservatives have not been ahead, that Keir Starmer will probably be the next Prime Minister. So you're putting a lot of time, effort and taxpayers' money into this scheme, which is, yes, a lot of people think it's a good idea, but also I looked at I did the calculation. You should never, ever trust a journalist with figures, ever. But I did a quick back of the envelope calculation. There are, as you say, 175,000 people in the asylum backlog in this country.
Yeah.
There are about 500 people who would be sent to Rwanda under the scheme. So if you come to this country as an asylum seeker, you have a 0.0002% chance of being sent to Rwanda.
It's incredible.
It's more than incredible.
Maybe, just maybe, Sunak feels like he can't U-turn on this because certain people have accused Keir Starmer of being such a flip-flopper, including Rishi Sunak.
That's part of it.
He can't do it
but
himself.
But he has a big threat from the right. He has a big threat from Suella Braverman. She is running...
His only threat is himself, his own party.
Yeah, well, he is opposed... The opposition Rishi Sunak is facing is far more serious on this particular policy from his own party than from the Labour Party.